He was dismissed as a grumpy, pony-sized runt, so unwanted that not a single bid was made when they tried to sell him. Yet today, almost every elite racehorse on Earth can trace their bloodline to this overlooked Canadian reject. How did a colt, born late and built like a bulldog, become the most powerful force in thoroughbred history? The answer lies in a gamble that nearly ended before it began. E.P. Taylor stood at the edge of his snowy Ontario farm, convinced that greatness could be engineered, even in the cold. While Kentucky breeders scoffed at the idea, Taylor poured his fortune into Windfield's farm, determined to match the blue bloods of the American South on his own frozen turf. He collected bloodlines like rare coins, searching for the perfect blend of speed, stamina, and nerve. For his most ambitious experiment, Taylor chose Natalma, a mare whose own career had been cut short by injury. She was the daughter of native dancer, a legend known for his blinding acceleration and fragile legs. Natalma's speed was never in doubt, but her body had proved too delicate for the grind of racing. Taylor believed her gifts could be preserved in the next generation if paired with the right stallion. That stallion was Najinsky, a Canadian champion with a reputation for brilliance and for being nearly impossible to handle. Najinsky's pedigree shimmered with potential, but his mind was a storm. He had been known to bite, kick, and bolt without warning, leaving trainers wary of his unpredictable temper. Still, his victories on the track were undeniable, and Taylor saw in him a raw energy that could ignite Natalma's finesse. The decision to breed Natalma to Najinsky was a calculated risk. On paper, the match promised a foal with the speed of native dancer and the toughness of Najinsky. In reality, it was a genetic gamble, mixing fragility with volatility, elegance with brute force. No one could predict what would emerge from that combination. Taylor pressed ahead, undeterred by whispers that Ontario's climate and his chosen bloodlines were a mismatch. For him, the experiment was more than a quest for a champion. It was a statement that world-class horses could be born north of the border, no matter how unlikely the odds. The result of that pairing would soon challenge everything the racing world thought it knew about pedigree, geography, and the limits of ambition. Northern Dancer arrived late to the world, born on May 27, 1961, weeks after most foals had already found their legs. He was small from the start, measuring just 14 hands as a yearling, and he did not stretch out with age. Instead, he thickened. His body grew round and blocky, with a chest like a barrel and legs that seemed too short for the job. His neck was powerful but compact, and his stance betrayed a slight crookedness in the knees. Instead of the long, elegant lines prized in thoroughbreds, he looked more like a stocky farm pony or a bulldog in racing silks. At Windfield's farm's annual yearling sale in 1962, E.P. Taylor set the reserve for his homebred colt at $25,000, a sum that reflected hope more than expectation. The auction ring, usually buzzing with anticipation for Taylor's horses, fell quiet as Northern Dancer was led in. Buyers shifted in their seats, studying the colt's short legs and heavy build. Whispers about his conformation, crooked knees and chunky frame circulated among the crowd. No one raised a hand. Not a single bid came forward. The auctioneer's voice echoed in the silence, then faded. The gavel fell, and Taylor was left to buy back his own colt, the runt that could not draw a single offer. The moment stung. For all the science and ambition behind his breeding, Taylor now faced the reality that the experts saw only flaws. Northern Dancer's name was missing from the sales ledger, replaced by a blank space where a buyer's name should have gone. Even among Taylor's own staff, there were doubts about whether the little bay would ever earn back his keep. In the world of high-stakes racing, where size and symmetry were everything, Northern Dancer was dismissed before he had even set foot on a track. Yet the colt returned to his stall, untouched by the day's humiliation. He ate, he kicked at his stall door, and he glared at anyone who came too close. The world had turned its back on him, but Northern Dancer still carried the volatile mix of speed and stubbornness that Taylor had gambled on. The auction ring had delivered its verdict. The story, though, was just beginning. Horatio Luro arrived at Windfield's farm with a reputation as a charmer and a gambler, a man who understood horses the way a conductor understands an orchestra, by feel and by instinct. He took one look at Northern Dancer and saw trouble. The colt was not just stubborn, he was combative. He pinned his ears, bit at the grooms, and kicked at the walls. Most trainers faced with a horse this headstrong would have reached for the simplest solution: geld him, remove the hormones, and remove the problem. Luro, frustrated by the colt's defiance, gave the order to geld. But E.P. Taylor stepped in. He refused to let the colt be cut. He was convinced the bloodlines he had assembled were too valuable to throw away for the sake of barnyard peace. The decision was less about sentiment than about vision. Taylor believed that greatness sometimes came wrapped in difficult packages. With the threat of gelding off the table, Luro had to find another way. He turned to a philosophy he had learned over decades of working with hot-blooded horses. He liked to say, "You do not squeeze the lemon dry. Push a horse like Northern Dancer too hard, and you risk breaking him." So Luro changed the script. While other trainers sent their colts out for long, punishing gallops, Luro kept Northern Dancer on a lighter routine. He trotted more than he galloped. He spent as much time being pampered as he did working. The exercise riders grumbled that the colt was carrying too much weight, but Luro ignored them. He watched the way Northern Dancer moved, saw the power packed into those short legs, and decided that less was more. Every day the colt's temperament simmered beneath the surface. He tested boundaries, challenged handlers, and refused to be bullied. But Luro's patience began to pay off. Northern Dancer's muscles thickened, his stride sharpened, and his energy built up like water behind a dam. The horse that no one wanted at auction was being shaped by a strategy designed not to break his spirit, but to harness it. The gamble was simple: protect the body, preserve the fire. Soon the racing world would see whether Luro's unorthodox methods had turned a barnyard outcast into a champion, ready for the spotlight. Northern Dancer's 2-year-old season began quietly in Canada, where he picked off smaller stakes races and built a modest reputation. But the real test came in November 1963, when his team shipped him to New York for the Remsen Stakes, a 1-mile race that drew the best colts on the East Coast. American trainers and reporters barely glanced at the Canadian entry. To them, he was just a stocky outsider with the wrong pedigree and the wrong build. The betting boards reflected it. Northern Dancer broke from the gate with his usual snap, settling into a rhythm that looked almost too easy. Jockey Manuel Icasa let him roll through the early fractions: 23 3/5 seconds for the first quarter, 47 1/5 seconds for the half. By the far turn, the so-called pony was still cruising on the lead, his stride churning with a power that belied his size. One by one, the American favorites tried to close the gap. None could get within 2 lengths. Northern Dancer hit the wire in 1 minute, 35 3/5 seconds, a new stakes record for the Remsen. The press box fell silent, then buzzed with confusion. Who was this Canadian colt, and how had he just run a stakes record mile against the best of New York? Headlines the next morning called him a mystery, a surprise, a fluke. But the numbers did not lie. 7 wins from 9 starts, over $90,000 in the bank, and a performance that forced even the skeptics to take notice. Northern Dancer had outgunned the Blue Bloods on their home turf, and the myth of the Canadian Runt began to crack. Northern Dancer's run of victories came to a sudden halt when a sharp crack split open the heel of his hoof, a quarter crack dreaded by trainers and owners alike. For most horses, this was a season-ending injury. The hoof structure is everything. A split heel can turn every stride into agony and a champion into a limping bystander. The team at Winfield's farm faced a problem with no easy solution. Surgery was risky. Rest meant missing the races that mattered. They needed a fix that did not exist until their farrier Bill Lane stepped forward. Bill Lane studied the colt's hoof, searching for a way to keep the crack from spreading while still allowing Northern Dancer to train and race. Traditional steel shoes would not do. The answer came from outside the usual playbook, a custom bar shoe crafted from vulcanized rubber. Unlike iron, the rubber absorbed shock and flexed with each step, cradling the injured heel and preventing every jolt from tearing the crack wider. The bar across the back of the shoe worked like a bridge, holding the hoof together, distributing pressure and letting the tissue knit itself back together. It was, in effect, a spare tire for a high-performance machine. This was more than a patch. It was an innovation that kept hope alive for the season's biggest races. The shoe allowed Northern Dancer to keep moving, keep building strength, and stay in the game when most horses would have been sidelined. Bill Lane's invention became a quiet turning point, a small act of ingenuity that made the difference between sitting out the Triple Crown and chasing history. For the rest of his career, Northern Dancer ran on legs that were fragile but fiercely protected. Proof that sometimes the margin between legend and obscurity is measured in inches of vulcanized rubber. Spring, 1964. Northern Dancer shipped south to Florida for the Flamingo Stakes, a $100,000 race that drew the best 3-year-olds on the continent. The air at Hialeah Park was thick with expectation. Most eyes were fixed on the tall, elegant colts from Kentucky and California, but it was the Canadian, built like a tank and running on a patched-up hoof, who broke from the gate with a burst. He pressed the leaders through the opening furlongs, his stride fast and relentless. By the far turn, he was gliding past the favorites, ears pinned, muscles rolling under his small frame. At the wire, he was 2 lengths clear, a decisive win, the first time a Canadian-bred horse had taken a major American prep of this size. The crowd buzzed, but the real drama played out behind the scenes. Bill Shoemaker, known as the Shoe, had piloted Northern Dancer in the Flamingo. Shoemaker was the most respected jockey in America, with a reputation for ice-cold judgment and a knack for picking Derby winners. Yet as the Derby loomed, Shoemaker stunned the Northern Dancer camp. He announced he was switching mounts, abandoning the Canadian colt for Hillrise, the towering California favorite. Shoemaker's logic was simple. Northern Dancer, short-legged and blocky, did not look like a classic distance horse. The Derby was 1.25 miles, a test of both speed and stamina. Shoemaker doubted the little horse could last. The snub landed like a slap. Horatio Luro, never one to hide his feelings, bristled at the slight. E.P. Taylor, who had watched his colt dismissed at the yearling sale and doubted by the American press, now saw the best jockey in the country turn his back on them. Northern Dancer's team steeled themselves. The horse, as always, seemed indifferent. He kicked at his stall, glared at grooms, and devoured his feed. But in the barn, the sense of insult was real. The experts had called the horse too small, too fat, too fragile. Now, even after a dominating win in Florida, he was being left behind for a rival with longer legs and flashier lines. Shoemaker's decision set the stage for a new partnership. The search began for a jockey who would trust the horse's engine, not his measurements. Northern Dancer's next ride would not be about pedigree or reputation. It would be about grit and the will to prove that the runt could outrun the giants. Bill Shoemaker's exit left a vacancy, but it did not take long for a new figure to step into the saddle. Bill Hartack, already a legend with 4 Kentucky Derby wins, arrived at the barn with a reputation for grit and a stubborn streak that matched Northern Dancer's own. Hartack was known for his no-nonsense approach. He did not waste words, did not care for small talk, and had little patience for doubters, human or horse. Where Shoemaker saw a liability, Hartack saw a challenge. He did not try to fight Northern Dancer's will in the mornings. Instead, He let the colt find his own rhythm, trusting the engine that had powered him through the winter stakes. As the derby drew closer, the press swarmed Churchill Downs, hungry for a story. The betting sheets listed Hill Rise as the clear favourite, towering over the field both in stature and in hype. Northern Dancer, shorter by a hand and heavier by a few pounds, drew sidelong glances from clockers and reporters. The horse's morning gallops were short and easy, never the long, punishing works that define a derby contender's final weeks. Luro logged only a handful of timed breezes, each one gentle enough to keep the colt's fragile legs safe. The barn rumour mill spun stories. Northern Dancer was too fat, too lazy, not fit enough to go 1.25 miles. One Louisville columnist wrote that the Canadian colt looked more like a pony than a derby horse. Hartack ignored the noise. He rode the horse with a loose rein, letting him roll through the stretch just enough to keep the edge sharp. Luro, always present but never overbearing, watched with a knowing smile. He had seen what happened when trainers tried to wring every last drop from a horse built like Northern Dancer. Instead, he kept the colt fresh, feeding him carrots and letting him sleep in. The exercise riders grumbled about the lack of hard work, but the numbers told their own story. Northern Dancer's heart rate dropped after each gallop. His appetite never wavered, and his stride stayed crisp and powerful. Reporters circled the barn, jotting down notes about the undertrained Canadian. The word lazy found its way into more than one headline. But inside the stall, there was nothing soft about Northern Dancer's glare. Hartack, for his part, seemed perfectly at home with a horse who refused to play by the usual rules. While the experts doubted, the pair quietly prepared for the race that would test every assumption the racing world held about what greatness looked like. May 2nd, 1964. The crowd at Churchill Downs pressed against the rail, eyes fixed on the starting gate. 22 colts had tried to run the Kentucky Derby in 2 minutes or less, and none had done it. At post time, the betting money poured in for Hill Rise, a California giant, unbeaten, taller by a head, with Bill Shoemaker in the irons. Northern Dancer, the Canadian upstart, stood in the gate at 15.2 hands, built like a tank, with Bill Hartack holding the reins loose. The bell rang. From the jump, Northern Dancer broke fast, settling mid-pack as the field hurtled through the opening quarter in 23 1/5 seconds. Hartack kept his hands quiet. The colt's stride was short but relentless, churning up the dirt as the leaders blazed the half in 47 flat. As they rounded the far turn, Hill Rise loomed on the outside, stretching for the lead. The favourite's long legs ate up ground, but Northern Dancer, ears pinned, dug in. Hartack angled him off the rail and asked for run. The response was instant, an explosion of power from those compact quarters. In the stretch, the two colts drew clear of the field, locked together, stride for stride. Hill Rise surged. Northern Dancer matched him, then edged ahead, his legs pumping like pistons. The wire flashed by. The margin was a neck. The time was 2 minutes flat, a new Kentucky Derby record. No Canadian bred had ever won the Derby before. No horse had ever run it so fast. The press box erupted. Reporters scrambled for superlatives. The so-called pony had beaten the giants, defied the experts, and stamped his name into racing history. Hartack, stone-faced, slipped from the saddle as the crowd roared. Northern Dancer stood in the winner's circle, sweat dark on his neck, barely winded. The doubters had been silenced. The little horse from Ontario had outrun them all, covering 1.25 miles faster than any before him. The track record would stand for 9 years until Secretariat came along. But on that first Saturday in May, the world belonged to Northern Dancer. 2 weeks after the Derby, the field lined up at Pimlico for the Preakness Stakes. This time, there were no questions about Northern Dancer's fitness, only whether his Derby victory had been a one-off. Hill Rise entered again, hungry for revenge, but the Canadian colt stood in the gate with the same cold focus. When the latch sprang, Northern Dancer broke sharply and settled just behind the leaders, conserving energy as the field thundered past the packed stands. Bill Hartack kept his hands quiet, letting the horse find his stride. At the far turn, the call came. Northern Dancer surged forward, his short legs churning up the Maryland dirt. Hillrise tried to match the move, but the gap only widened. Down the stretch, Northern Dancer pulled away with a burst that left no doubt. He crossed the wire 2.5 lengths in front, ears flicking back and forth as if daring anyone to come closer. The clock read 1 minute 56 4/5 seconds. Fast, efficient, and uncatchable. The crowd roared, and Canadian flags waved in the infield. Skeptics had called his Derby win a fluke, but the Preakness left no room for debate. Northern Dancer was now the undisputed champion of his generation, and his legend was just beginning to spread beyond the border. The Belmont Stakes pushed Northern Dancer to his absolute limit. The race stretched 1.5 miles, far beyond his comfort zone. For the first time, his stride, so quick and efficient at shorter distances, began to falter. Down the final stretch, the field swept past him. He finished third, spent but unbroken. The dream of an American Triple Crown slipped away, but the story was far from over. Back in Canada, anticipation built to a fever pitch. The Queen's Plate at Woodbine was not just another race, it was a homecoming. Crowds packed the grandstands, waving maple leaf flags and shouting themselves hoarse. News cameras rolled as schoolchildren skipped class and families crowded the rail, eager for a glimpse of their new hero. Northern Dancer, the so-called Runt, entered the parade ring with his ears pinned and his muscles rippling. The field barely mattered. When the gates flew open, he shot to the front, his legs churning over the familiar ground. By the far turn, the race was over. He stormed down the stretch, pulling away with every stride. At the wire, he was 7.5 lengths clear, untouchable, unstoppable. The eruption from the stands shook the old racetrack. Northern Dancer was not just a racehorse anymore. He was Canada's champion, a symbol of pride and possibility. For one perfect afternoon, the little bay colt who had been rejected and doubted was carried by a nation's roar. The Queen's Plate became his crowning moment, and the legend of Northern Dancer was sealed in the hearts of his people. Northern Dancer's racing days ended not with a final, glorious sprint, but with a step that went wrong. After the Queen's Plate, the colt cooled out quietly, and his handlers noticed a swelling low on his left front leg. The diagnosis was clear and cruel, a bowed tendon. In racing, this is the injury that stops time. The tendon fibers, stretched and torn by the relentless pounding of the track, cannot recover to withstand the demands of high-speed racing. Even the best care could not promise a safe return. Just like that, the little bay who had outrun the giants was finished as an athlete. His record stood at 14 wins, 2 seconds, and 2/3 from 18 starts, with earnings of $580,647, a Canadian record at the time. Yet, as the racing world processed the news, Windfield's farm quietly prepared for a new chapter. Northern Dancer retired to stud with an initial fee of $10,000. It was a respectable sum, but hardly a figure to shake the bloodstock world. The barn that once housed the fiercest competitor in North America now sheltered a stallion on the mend, his left front leg forever marked by the injury that ended his run. The racetrack closed behind him, and a different kind of race was about to begin, one that would reach far beyond the finish line. In 1970, a chestnut colt named Najinsky II thundered down the straight at Doncaster, leaving the crowd stunned and the racing world scrambling for answers. Born in Canada but trained in Ireland, Najinsky swept through the English Triple Crown, winning the 2,000 Guineas, the Epsom Derby, and the St. Leger Stakes. No horse had managed this feat in 35 years, and none would do it again for decades. The headlines belonged to Najinsky, but behind his triumph, breeders and bloodstock agents were suddenly fixated on his sire, Northern Dancer. Until then, Northern Dancer's stud fee had been respectable, but not extraordinary. Najinsky's dominance on both turf and dirt shattered old prejudices about Canadian blood and small size. The so-called Runt was not just producing winners, he was producing legends. Stallion books filled overnight. For the first time, buyers from Europe, Japan, and the Middle East began calling Winfield's farm, eager for a piece of the magic. Najinsky's Triple Crown turned a Canadian curiosity into the most sought-after bloodline on Earth. Bloodstock agents once dismissed Northern Dancer as a curiosity, but by the late 1970s, his offspring were winning everywhere, from the Kentucky Derby to the Epsom Derby and the Arc de Triomphe. Suddenly, his yearlings became the most sought-after currency in racing. At Keeneland, the world's richest buyers crowded the sales pavilion, clutching catalogues marked with his name. Robert Sangster, the British gambler-turned-breeder, led a syndicate that scoured the globe for Northern Dancer colts, while the Maktoum family of Dubai arrived with oil money and a hunger for dominance. Bidding wars erupted over unproven yearlings, some fetching up to $10 million before they ever set foot on a track. Auctioneers hammered home record after record as the price of Northern Dancer's bloodlines soared. The colt nobody wanted at $25,000 now fueled an international frenzy. In the space of a decade, his progeny turned the sales ring into a battleground where fortunes were made or lost in a single afternoon. Northern Dancer had become the first true global currency in horse racing. His influence measured not in hands or inches, but in millions. At the height of the bloodstock boom, Northern Dancer's value reached a level the industry had never seen. Winfield's farm set his stud fee at $1 million, payable in advance, with no guarantee of a live foal. This meant breeders paid the full price for just a chance at his genetics. If their mare did not conceive, the money was gone. The risk was staggering, but so was the potential reward. Year after year, his offspring topped sales around the world, commanding prices that dwarfed the purses of major races. The demand for a Northern Dancer foal turned breeding into high finance, drawing in syndicates and investors who treated stallion contracts like blue-chip stocks. For smaller breeders, the price was out of reach. A single mating cost more than most farms earned in a year. But for those who could afford it, the promise of a champion, backed by bloodlines proven on every continent, was worth every cent. Northern Dancer's stud career did not just break records, it changed the economics of the sport. Geneticists studying Northern Dancer's legacy often point to a simple twist of DNA as the secret behind his dynasty. The myostatin gene, which controls muscle efficiency and sprint power, likely gave him and his offspring the ability to explode from the gate and sustain speed, even though it never added an inch to their height. While most breeders chased tall, elegant frames, Northern Dancer passed on a blueprint for compact. Powerful bodies that ran like well-oiled machines. His sons and daughters inherited that low-slung engine, outpacing rivals across continents. Retirement did nothing to dull his spirit. At Winfield's farm, grooms learned the hard way that the old stallion called the shots. He would stand in the rain for hours, refusing to come inside, or sit down in the middle of the paddock, daring anyone to move him. The farm staff joked that he knew he was royalty, and he acted like it every day. The proof of his impact is written across decades of racing. Sadler's Wells, his most famous son, became Europe's leading sire 14 times. Galileo, his grandson, extended the reign into the modern era. For 40 years, Northern Dancer's bloodline has shaped champions, not just surviving, but growing stronger with every generation. Today, the economics and genetics of horse racing still orbit the legacy of one undersized outlier. With nearly 70% of thoroughbreds tracing back to Northern Dancer, every major auction and every breeding decision echoes his improbable impact. In an industry obsessed with pedigree and perfection, his story is a reminder: Greatness isn't measured in inches, but in the power to redefine what's possible. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts below.